dead bodies floating in the muck or covered under blankets by the side of the highway. Families holding up signs pleading for rescue. On August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina slammed into New Orleans, causing protective levees to breach and submerging 80% of the city underwater. Though most of the city's residents had heeded evacuation orders and left before the storm hit, those who stayed, the poor, the sick, the stubborn, found themselves living in a city drowning in toxic lake water, fouled with sewage, petrochemicals, and death. 4 days after the storm, when President George W. Bush made his belated visit to the region, New Orleans was in desperate shape. That Friday afternoon, he and the city's mayor, Ray Nagin, and the state's governor, Kathleen Blanco, toured the city by helicopter. They surveyed some of the scenes that would come to define the tragedy of Katrina: the mostly African-American Lower Ninth Ward, adjacent to the breached levee of the Industrial Canal, still covered in water; the Louisiana Superdome, a squalid refuge of last resort that had warehoused an estimated 30,000 people without adequate food, sanitation, or medical assistance. After the tour, standing on the airport tarmac, an uncertain and overmatched president told the city, "I want you to know that I'm not going to forget what I've seen." But on that Friday, it was an event that almost no one had taken notice of in the often overlooked Algiers section of New Orleans that in time would assume its own resonant, macabre significance. For 14 years, I would be consumed with trying to redress what had happened there. The effort would shape who I became as a lawyer and fundamentally change how I understood the American justice system. Algiers sits on the west bank of the Mississippi and, owing to its higher elevation, did not flood after the storm. Though the hurricane's high winds and torrential rains felled trees, damaged roofs, and shattered plenty of windows, Algiers was spared the devastation of much of the rest of the city. In the first few days after Katrina, the Algiers residents who stayed likely figured they had successfully ridden out the storm. The neighborhood had taken a beating, but seemingly not worse or not much worse than what other storms had delivered in the past. The reality, however, was that Algiers was too cut off from the rest of the city to understand just how isolated it really was. There was no power or television, telephone lines were down, and cell phone service was spotty at best. News and rumors, often indistinguishable, filtered in by word of mouth. Few in Algiers could fathom that on the other side of the river, most of New Orleans was underwater, and unlike after past storms, essential city services would not be coming back anytime soon. As the days dragged on, the unsettling thing about Algiers was the desolation. The few remaining people seemed lost in their own neighborhoods. One resident, an officer with the New Orleans Police Department, NOPD, 4th District, which patrols Algiers, later compared what she saw to a horror movie. Everybody was just walking around like zombies. The street looked like a ghost town. In the first days after the hurricane hit, law enforcement had been widely regarded as heroic by many in New Orleans. The local police traveled city streets that had been transformed into murky canals in their small boats, plucking residents out of their attics. The National Coast Guard hovered over houses in their helicopters, lowering metal-framed cages down to citizens stranded on their rooftops, withering under a brutally hot sun. But as the days passed and incompetence and political infighting bogged down the government relief effort, the mood on the city streets turned ugly. Looting became rampant. Many residents took basic supplies from abandoned stores simply to survive, while others went on a shopping spree that included consumer electronics, luxury cars, and guns. By September 2nd, most of the people left in Algiers fell into one of two camps: the poorest of the mostly African-American population and the police. Relations between these two groups were becoming increasingly tense. If you were